Get following there and interact as often as you would like. All your feedback, guest suggestions and other input is greatly welcomed. So, on to the show. This week's guest is Mark Gaffney. Mark is an environmentalist, he's a peace activist and a researcher and writer. Over the years, his articles and essays have appeared in numerous journals, magazines, newspapers and widely on the internet. He's the author of 5 books including Black 9/11, Money, Motive and Technology, and 9/11 is exactly what we'll be speaking about today. Mark, you're very welcome to Alchemy Radio. How are you?
Good morning, John. Very happy to be with you.
No, the pleasure is all mine, and I have a question that I ask almost every guest when they come on the show for the first time, so I'm going to ask you the very same question. I'm wondering, how did you get from where you were, how did it all start off, to where you are now?
Well, John, kind of a long story, but to make that short, I was really quite complacent for many years. You know, I just assumed that Bill Clinton was doing his job as president, you know, taking care of the country. And I had a rude awakening. It didn't happen till around 2006 when I began to look back and realize what a disaster the last 10 years had been, you know?
Yeah.
And so I got involved in 9/11 research when I first heard about the tritium that was discovered at the World Trade Center in Building 6, deep in the bathtub there at the World Trade Center. And I don't know if you know this, but I had been doing research on nuclear weapons. My first book was about Israel's nuclear weapon program. And so my ears pricked right up when I heard about that tritium because it's one of the indicators for nuclear blast. And there was also a possibility of a electromagnetic pulse. And, you know, this got me started on 9/11 research. I didn't find anything more on that, but there was so much other stuff that I just never lost interest. And my first paper was a critique of the Nist Report, Nist. They did that was the official study of the World Trade Center collapse. And, you know, one thing led to another after that.
So the rabbit hole was open, so to speak, and we're still delving further and further in as time goes on. You mentioned there the tritium that was found at the site. I mean, that must have been like, excuse the pun, but a time bomb for you in terms of the work that you had been doing. I mean, what kind of effect did it have on you? Was it all of a sudden it's hang on a minute, I know, as opposed to suspecting something is not what it seems? How big an effect did it have on your life? Was it a case of, right, let's drop everything and delve into the information as much as we can, or was it a more gradual process?
Well, it was rather abrupt, actually. I went from being complacent and not doing anything, not doing any research, to researching it almost full time for quite a while. And so, yeah, it was life-changing. And, the more you learn about 9/11, the more absorbing it is, just because there's just so much material. It blows your mind, really. The more you learn, the more you realize what a great lie we've been told.
And let's delve into that great lie, Mark, because surely to God, 9/11 was planes being hijacked. September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists with box cutters crashed into the World Trade Center, and that's it. Surely there can't be any more to that.
Well, it's a cover story, and people have to understand this. The official investigations, for example, the 9/11 Commission, they were not interested in finding out what really happened. They were interested in just bolstering the cover story and maintaining the cover story, and that is why so many vital pieces of evidence and eyewitness testimony was simply ignored. You know, it never made it into the 9/11 Commission report. All the other evidence was discarded, ignored, suppressed, and so on.
And one of the fascinating things that I found in the aftermath of 9/11, and for me it was much, much later, it was years later that I started to look into it for myself, but when I started to do a little bit of research, and like a lot of people I was looking at videos and stuff like that on YouTube, I started to notice that a lot of eyewitness testimony, initial eyewitness testimony, was very, very different to the official story that eventually emerged from 9/11. So how valuable was that initial information? And the extent of the cover-up that appears to have been put in place then is so massive that it can only be grand conspiracy. So what would you say about the initial responders and what happened to a lot of them in the aftermath of 9/11 and how that cover-up was achieved? Because the media is everywhere.
Well, that's how they did it. They control the media. And you're right. The initial eyewitness accounts are very startling. I mean, there were over 100, for example, I'll give you one example. There were more than 100 firefighters in New York who testified about explosives at the World Trade Center. And the New York Fire Department actually did a study on their own to record all the testimony. And this was down on videotape. I guess they made written transcripts of all their people. There were over 100 of them that reported explosives. And this paper, this write-up, this report, was actually made available to the 9/11 Commission. They had it. And yet, they did not. There's only one brief mention of it in the report, and they twisted it to make it seem that there were no explosives going on. They turned it completely around on its head.
And of course, then people will wave this massive copy of the report and the commission in front of us when anybody questions the official line and say, no, well, I mean, a full-scale, thorough investigation took place and the official story is what it is now. But there is so much that was left out of that, and I mean, clearly left out deliberately. What would be, I suppose, the key pieces of information that should have been in there if it was a thorough and full investigation that were blatantly omitted from that?
Well, there's a whole list of things. For one thing, for example, the destruction of evidence. I mean, no sooner had this event happened than the World Trade Center site was cordoned off, and the pieces of steel were removed immediately. They were taking out evidence that could have determined what happened, and this went on unstopped for months. And when FEMA began its investigation, that was one of the early investigations. Their forensics people, couldn't even get on site. They were not even allowed in to examine the evidence. They had to be taken on guided tours. And this was the pattern that, it was just controlling the flow of information right from the beginning.
So let's look, Mark, now into who may have executed and planned what happened on 9/11, why they might have done it, and I suppose all the questions that will lead on from there. I mean, surely there was nobody, bar Al-Qaeda, who would have any kind of incentive to attack America in such a heinous way.
Well, one of the major failings of the official report, the Nist Report, for example, they never tested for residues at the World Trade Center. And had they done so, they would have found them. That's undoubtedly why they never looked. But the fact that there had to have been explosives in those buildings tells us that there had to be complicity at very high levels on Wall Street and with the U.S. government. There had to be complicity at the highest level. So I'm not going to name names, but follow the money and follow the dots.
Indeed, and there were a series of amazing coincidences as well that took place that just surrounded the whole chain of events leading up and after the actual attacks. Money, of course, is at the root of so much that we see in the world around us at the moment, and 9/11 is no exception, as you've just touched on there. And, of course, you've written now extensively about the financial trail that has led you to many of the conclusions that you have ultimately reached with regard to September the 11th. So let's talk about the finance and the insider trading and the money trail that existed, because it's absolutely fascinating when you start to piece together the dots that have been left behind there.
Yes, it really is. For example, the number 3 man at the CIA, Buzzy Krongard, and this information was leaked while during the Securities and Exchange Commission investigation in the aftermath of 9/11. And I believe that investigation started out as an honest one, and then it was simply they buried the truth, because they found that the number 3 man at the CIA, his former bank, AB Brown, was linked to these put options that were purchased just in the days before 9/11. So this was insider trading going on. Buzzy Krongard was in the know, and he had he still had connections with that bank, and this just went away. It just kind of dropped out of the media. It was leaked, and then it just disappeared.
So in essence, what you're saying then there, Mark, is that it appears there were people at the highest level who knew in advance what to do and how to profit financially from the situation that was set to arise.
Yes, John, and what is really interesting to me is that you have for example, the number 3 man, Buzzy Krongard at the CIA, who appeared to be fully in the loop about what was going to happen, and yet his boss, George Tenet, 2 doors down the hallway, appears to have been out of the loop. He didn't really have the details about what was coming. And if you look at Tenet's, read his memoirs, it's very revealing, because this guy, I'm convinced he really did not know. He knew something was coming, but he didn't have he wasn't fully briefed. And he mentions, for example, in the very first page of his memoirs, how on September the 12th, early in the morning, he shows up at the White House, and Tenet used to go to the White House every day to brief G.W. Bush. Well, that morning, guess who was already there when he got there? The Prince of Darkness, Richard Pearl, one of the neocons, was already there. And Tenet, can't understand this. He's all puzzled about this. Why would Pearl be there? Well, undoubtedly he was there to brief Bush about what he needed to know. It's all about need to know and compartmentalization of intelligence. And this is how they keep this story secret. It's very compartmentalized.
And that's quite a clever way, if you are looking to hide the truth of anything. It's quite a clever way of doing it, because if little people are kind of essentially cogs in the information machine, it's very easy to remove a cog and replace it with something else without having to affect the entire machinery as it operates. It's a very good way of doing it, and I suppose that might explain why it is that it has been successfully brushed under the carpet in the way that it has, in terms of leaching through to the mainstream media. I mean, there are obviously a huge number of people who question what happened at 9/11, and there's a huge amount of research being done on it, but not that many people look at the actual high level and behind the scenes financial transactions that took place surrounding it, and of course the covert activity that took place then at the very top, as you mentioned there, in the CIA. That's the story that tends not to get told, and I think it's the most telling of all, because it's much easier to disseminate the other information if you have some kind of context or framework for it. And I think the financial side of it provides that framework that many people are lacking.
One of the mistakes that so many people make, John, is they say, well, the government can't keep secrets. There's no way they could have kept this secret. Well, I'm sorry. Daniel Ellsberg, you might remember him from The Man Who Released the Pentagon Papers, wrote a very interesting book about his experiences. And he explains that, government keeps secrets very well. And it's because of just what I said. It's because of the need to know and the compartmentalization of information. That's how they do it. And they're very good at it.
Well, they are extremely good.
Very few people had the full story. Very few of the people who planned and orchestrated these events had the full picture about what was going to happen.
So in terms of the full picture then, let's speculate as to the reasons why those who committed these atrocities did it. I mean, are we looking at a Pearl Harbor false flag event, or is it something more than that, Mark, do you think?
Well, I think that's enough. Believe me, I believe that's what it was. Yeah.
Okay.
Pearl Harbor type event, a false flag operation, and the neocons were right out in the open about this. They posted a paper on the internet a couple years before 9/11 in which they called for a great expansion of U.S. military power worldwide, and a great expansion of the U.S. military. And they said, well, to bring this transformation about, it may take a new Pearl Harbor. They're really open about it.
With regard then to George Bush and the neocons, do you think it was a direct US government plot? Do you think it was aided and abetted perhaps by foreign agencies or foreign powers? Or how deep does the rabbit hole go politically, in your opinion, with regard to the attacks?
Interesting question. Now, and some of this is just speculation, but I think I would call it an informed guess. Mm-hmm. Okay? I think there's good reason to think that that U.S. officials were involved, that Elements of the U.S. military were involved, elements from the U.S. intelligence community. There were also foreign intelligence agencies involved. I'm for certain the Israelis, the Mossad, and there were also private contractors, involved, corporations, secret, entities. And so what we have is a network, and it's kind of a good old boy network of partly cronyism. Some of these secret organizations, like Skull and Bones, may have been involved. These guys have known each other since college. When they need a favor, they call somebody up on the phone. This is how this works. And they reach right down, through different bureaucracies and government agencies to individuals. And so there's a kind of the chain of command of the military, for example, doesn't really function with this kind of network.
It kind of operates outside the normal bands or the normal structures. That's
right. It's almost like I think Peter Dale Scott called it the deep state. It's kind of a supranational network, that involves. It's not even just national; it's international.
Yeah, so it goes beyond the boundaries of nationality or political ideology or anything like that. It's something else entirely. It's a different club.
It's a private club. That's right.
Okay, so let's look, Mark, then at who benefited, because you mentioned some of the multinationals, and obviously the war machine has benefited hugely from what happened after 9/11, because the world changed, and it changed almost overnight in the grand scheme of things. I mean, what we see now going on, everything from airport security to the US war machine internationally, and I suppose empirical advances, for want of a better term, with regard to the US, I think it's something that would shock somebody if they were told that was going to happen in the 1980s, unless they were extremely well informed. And of course the media has a large part to play in the picture that is painted there, and in developing the paradigms that exist in the common person, you or I or Joe Soap or whoever it might be. So who were these companies, and in what way did they benefit? I mean, we know they benefited obviously financially, but on what scale? So I mean, what made it worthwhile doing for who?
Well, take for example the companies that were listed by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They listed 38 companies that were suspected, of being involved in insider trading. And on that list, are companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Hercules. These are military contractors. Raytheon stock jumped 37% after 9/11. And sure enough, the people who had, there was a lot of Raytheon stock purchased just in the days before 9/11. So those people, made out like bandits. There was a 600% jump, surge in call options for Raytheon. So there were a lot of people who suspected or had inside knowledge that Raytheon stock was going to go up.
Wow, so there were astronomical figures involved.
Yeah, we're talking about huge amounts of money.
And speaking of these astronomical figures, there's a very interesting guy who's certainly worth mentioning, I think, at this point, and that's Larry Silverstein. What can you tell us about him and his activity in and around 9/11?
Well, he's known for a number of connections here. He had the lease on the World Trade Center building. We know that, and this was just these plans were made just in the weeks before, a couple of months before 9/11. And he didn't really put up very much money at all, and he walked off with, after he had purchased insurance against terrorist attacks, I think the figure was around $4.5 billion that he walked away with. That was a payoff from the insurance.
Wow.
So this guy's definitely tied in with the people behind 9/11. There's no question about it.
There are many more amazing coincidences that surround the whole affair. Can you let us in on some of them? Because I think a lot of people mightn't be aware of just how anomalous everything that went on was.
Well, if you look at the connections with American intelligence, American insurance, AIG, this huge insurance corporation that they were owned, for example, the Kroll, the Wall Street CIA that was responsible for security at the World Trade Center, and the CEO of AIG, his son, Maurice Greenberg's son was actually the head of Marsh & McLennan, another insurance company that was based on the 95th floor of Building 1, and took the direct hit of American Airlines 11. So his offices were the target. And, you know, these coincidences just don't happen. This is just too coincidental. You know, there is no coincidence in the world. I mean, things happen because things are planned, you know?
Absolutely, and this seems to have been very, very carefully planned, to the extent that there seem to have been people and indeed whole companies who were forewarned or may have been given some kind of advance notice that they shouldn't turn up for work on that day. Can you shed any light on that?
Oh, yeah, and, you know, we know that, for example, Richard Grove was one of the whistleblowers that I spoke with. He was involved with AIG, and he had connections with Marsh & McLennan. His company, he was involved in a company that sold software, and they had a contract with Marsh & McLennan to produce a very proprietary software. They had to have it installed by July the 15th, 2001. He was working around the clock to bring this about, and there were he had discovered improprieties and evidence of hanky-panky and fraud, and he was told to just keep quiet. And later, he had actually after he was fired, because he was a whistleblower there, he maintained contact with some of the staffers there at Marsh & McLennan that he believed were honest and were really interested in trying to clean things up and bring this to light. There was a meeting that was supposed to take place on the morning of 9/11 at Marsh & McLennan, the 95th floor, and there was going to be a truth-telling event, you know, where they were going to confront the higher executives with this evidence. And guess what? All those people died in that the crash of AA-11 into the office. Richard Grove just happened to be caught in downtown traffic and was late, and that's what saved his life. And the Marsh & McLennan executive was uptown. He was going to participate by video conference. So he was never there. You know, he never showed up. So these are the sorts of things that really make you wonder.
Well, they really do, and even beyond that, I mean, it kind of stretches the bounds of realistic possibility that all these coincidences could be just that.
AIG, for example, you know, most of the the U.S. insurance industry took a huge hit because of 9/11. I think it was something like $40 billion that they had to pay out, you know. But AIG came out smelling like a rose. That was one of their biggest years, 2001. So they were, you know, Maurice Greenberg and the people who had insider knowledge, they positioned themselves to survive it and actually made money off it.
And in terms of corporate America, far from being the tragedy that it was for the common man or woman, 9/11 actually turned out to be quite a major event in a positive way for the I suppose the bank balances of these huge conglomerates.
Oh yeah, and for example, there was an employee at Deutsche Bank that contacted Mike Rupert, and he talks about this in his book, Crossing the Rubicon, who had insisted that he remain anonymous because he was concerned about his own personal safety. But he told Rupert that the computers at Deutsche Bank, and it was located right across the street from the World Trade Center, it was heavily damaged, but the building stood. The computers started going crazy just in the moments before the attack and during the attack, and it was like they were being programmed. They were doing their own thing, right? Processing information. Who knows? Money was possibly being laundered. You know, securities being traded. There was hanky-panky going on just in the moments before the attack.
Right, so we're looking at clear motive for quite a number of interested parties then. And of course, the event does happen then, but there are a lot of question marks surrounding what actually happened as well. Again, we look at the the regular story that's trotted out. We had Mohammed Atta and a load of his friends who hated the US and hate everything about the West. And they decided with box cutters they were going to hijack these two planes and crash them into the Twin Towers, which then fell at free fall speed to the ground in a big cloud of dust, and then there was much weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, and that's not in any way to take away from the suffering of so many people and their families, because it was a massive human tragedy. Aside from that, though, we have some major issues, and I think quite often the authorities and the mainstream media use the human side of it and the fact that it was so tragic for so many people to paper over the little cracks that exist when somebody questions the official line. Well, how dare you question, look at all these people who were affected, how dare you kind of denigrate their memory or whatever. Well, we're not doing that here at all. We're just trying to look at some facts. And one of the facts of the matter is that there are many more anomalies that exist on a technological level. It couldn't possibly have been as simple as these two planes crashed into the World Trade Center and brought the Twin Towers down in the way that they did. Am I right in saying that, Mark?
Oh, absolutely. Those buildings were overbuilt. I did a very, very thorough study of the World Trade Center and the Nist Report, and the core columns of there were 47 core columns, and then they had an outer wall, exterior columns. But the World Trade Center core columns were like 7 inches thick at the base. This was a massively over-constructed building. In fact, at my alma mater, Colorado State, they have a wind tunnel, and the man who used to run that wind tunnel did the wind studies on the World Trade Center design before it was constructed. Right. And when he died a couple years ago, they had a write-up in my alma mater magazine. This guy claimed, insisted to the very end, that those buildings were rugged and could never have fallen. They were not. They implied in many of the news stories, and even some of the official papers after 9/11, that there was some kind of flaw in the World Trade Center design. That's hogwash. These buildings were designed to take the impact of an airliner. There's no way the planes could have brought the buildings down, and the jet fuel was insignificant. It's just kerosene. It doesn't burn that hot. There's no way you can melt steel. There's no way you can even soften it. So no, the official story that the planes and the fires caused the collapse is just hogwash. It's a cover story. What really angers me, John, is that the scientific community has stood by and allowed this nonsense to stand. We should have had many more engineers and scientists come forward and to point out that this is ridiculous. This couldn't have happened. So where are all these people? Are they just worried about their jobs? The country here is in a dire state. You have to step forward. You just can't allow this sort of lie to go on.
It's beyond ridiculous for anybody who looks to delve a little bit deeper than the mainstream cover story that what supposedly happened could have happened in the way that it did. And many listeners to this show will be familiar with the work of Dr. Judy Wood and how she has managed to look at the simple scientific facts of how the buildings may or may not have fallen, what could have happened and what couldn't happen. And she's managed to do it without any kind of any political paradigm, and she's not too concerned necessarily with why it may have happened and background stories. She's just concerned with the facts. And I mean, she pretty much makes a very, very convincing case for the fact that these planes couldn't have possibly brought the buildings down in the way that they did. You've already made reference to the 100-odd first responders and firefighters who testified to the fact that there were explosions and explosives in the buildings. If much of the footage is studied quite clearly and quite plainly, you can see explosions rippling demolition style through the building. And I mean, there are some ridiculous excuses preferred for that. Again, jet fuel being the big one. This kerosene drifted down through the building at breakneck speed and just blew out large areas of supporting columns of the building. I mean, as you say, complete hogwash, to use your term there. And I think you're entirely correct with it. So how did the buildings come down, Mark? How was it in the space of 11 or 12 seconds that buildings and structures of this size that were designed to resist exactly such a supposed impact did come down?
Well, they were demolished. They were systematically demolished right in front of our eyes, and we were told that this was a classic collapse, whatever that means. That has no meaning, in the science world. It's just a term that they cooked up to try to convince us that this was a classic building collapse. There is no such thing. One of the really interesting data sets is the seismic data from 9/11, and here again we were lied to. We had these seismic signals that they interpreted initially. They told us that this was the seismic signal of the AA-11 hitting the the 95th floor of the North Tower. Well, guess what? It wasn't the seismic signal of any impact. Plane hitting 95th floor of the World Trade Center, that kinetic energy would have been completely absorbed by the building. It would never have been coupled with the ground. It would never have caused a seismic signal. The seismic signal that corresponds with that event was actually the explosion in the basement that was coupled with the ground, and therefore caused a seismic signal. And this was reported by William Rodriguez. He was one of the janitors down there who felt this huge explosion from below. And this was reported, and he had he gave testimony to the 9/11 Commission. I get 2 hours of testimony behind closed doors. Not one word made it into the 9/11 Commission report. So there you go.
Well, that's
Andre Rousseau, the seismologist, has posted a paper. I want to add this for your listeners. He has posted a paper putting all this together about the seismic evidence, which is now up at the Journal of 9/11 Studies. And which can be, it's very readable, and I encourage people to take a look at it.
Mm-hmm. That's very telling in itself.
Yeah,
why would information like that be discounted? It's vital, presumably.
Well, where are the journalists that should have brought this to light in the press? They should have been all over this like a fly on, what? I mean, this should have drawn their attention. The journalists should have written this up. I mean, this is a major, major story, how we were lied to about the seismic evidence. And it just never happened.
And it's one of many lies. The flight paths are a very interesting one, and the actual planes themselves, and the story surrounding that, because there are many massive and glaring anomalies with regard to the so-called hijackers, about who was actually on what planes and how these planes were controlled. So let's touch on that for a little while, Mark, because there is some fascinating information that you've brought to light with regard to all of that.
Well, yeah, and let's get into some of this new research I've been doing about Flight 93, because that touches on all this issue. This was the fourth plane, Flight 93. That's the one that took off from Newark, and it was delayed. Its takeoff was delayed by 43 minutes, and it was the one that went down at Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of reports that the plane might have been shot down. There are all kinds of stories on the internet about it, and it's interesting. There's a lot of disinformation, a lot of confusion about this flight, but it is interesting, and I've tried to cut through all the layers of disinfo and try to get at the facts, and that's what I'm writing about. I have a paper that is being peer-reviewed on this by an online journal. It hasn't appeared yet, but we can talk about it. There was a controversy about Flight 93 because the official crash time of 10:03 was based on the flight data recorder. And yet, again, we have seismic signal apparently for Flight 93 that happened at 10:06. So you had 3-minute separation here between the seismic signal and the official crash time. And so what is going on here? Ever since 9/11, we have been told that the way it was interpreted in the media is, well, it's got to be one or the other, right? It's either or.
Yeah.
And that's the way I thought, too, for quite a while. However, as I've gotten into this, I realized that that's the wrong approach. I believe that these were actually two separate events, one at 10:03 and one at 10:06. And I believe the 9/11 Commission really had to work hard to cover this up. If they really wanted to find out the truth about 9/11, they could have exposed this. If they had simply tried to explain this controversy, what happened over the crash time, they could have blown the lid right off 9/11, the whole story. but of course they were interested in just preserving the cover story, so they didn't do that. They didn't go there.
And where should they have gone then with it? I mean, what are we looking at in terms of that anomaly?
Well, when you look at the crash site, the alleged crash site at Shanksville. Now, I visited Shanksville and talked to a lot of people there, and they were really friendly. Shanksville is a very interesting. It's a great little place. The people there are very open, friendly. Everybody was willing to talk. I did not run into any rednecks or knee-jerk reactions. And it was really a wonderful experience being there. And what I learned was that when I was there, I stopped at the high school and I talked to the principal. He gave me a pass to go around and talk to all the teachers. And they told me that morning, and the school is in town. It's located in town, about 3 miles from the crash site. The teachers told me that morning they felt a shock wave pass through the building, and of course they assumed this was from the crash. Well, when I consulted with Andre Rousseau, this geophysicist, he said, "Oh no, plane crash would not cause a seismic signal like that. It would not. I mean, it would not cause a shock wave like that." And so this is evidence of ordnance, military ordnance going off. This was a huge explosion that happened at 10:06, and that's what caused the seismic signal. Okay. Now, if you look at the alleged crash site, and I talked to people who were there that day. They told me a couple of people were the first ones to arrive at the scene, and these guys told me that they drove in a pickup truck from Indian Lake, which was a couple miles away, and as they were driving toward the crash site, little tiny pieces of debris was falling in the back of the truck. And we know there was a guy who was fishing out on Indian Lake that morning. He said he looked up, heard the noise of a plane, looked up, and he actually saw pieces of plane falling away from the plane. It was disintegrating in the air. So if you look at the crash site, there's no wreckage. I mean, we just had a crash of a Malaysian jetliner in Ukraine, and I would encourage your listeners to go up there on the internet. There's photos all over the internet. There's all kinds of pictures, and you can see these huge pieces of wreckage. Some of it's recognizable. I saw photographs of the landing gear, for example, and this is really hard steel, which tends to survive an impact. And you can see bodies, just visible bodies in the wreckage. And this is what it would have looked like if Flight 93 had been shot down, if it had been a missile that shot it down. But there was none of that. I mean, the pieces were tiny. People who got there couldn't even tell it was a plane had crashed there. There was just a crater in the ground and a smoking crater, and that was it. So the debris was scattered over several square miles, which itself is anomalous. Supposedly, one jet engine was located about 1,800 feet away, way off in a forest somewhere. That's not normal. This is not a normal crash scene. So this is totally anomalous. So what the evidence said to me, this plane was blown up in midair before it ever hit the ground. And it wasn't just blown up, it was blown to bits. There were no bodies recovered. There were human remains, little tiny pieces of flesh, slivers of bone. I mean, it's really dramatically different from this crash that just took place in Ukraine.
It's almost like it was liquidated.
Yeah, it's almost like it was just, liquidated. That's a good word for it. And this never came out, really. The official investigation just papered over all this. So the other thing that I discovered, there is, and I was really surprised because I never expected it. I didn't want to believe it. That we have a witness, Susan McElwain, who lived in the area, and that morning she was out in her car, and she did not know about what was happening in New York. She only learned later. And this thing went right over her vehicle, She thought it was a little airplane or something, an aircraft, about 40, 50 feet off the ground. It was so low that it caused her to duck. And she was at a stop sign when this thing went right over her. And it turns out that what she saw meets the description, it fits the description of a cruise missile. Okay? And I believe now that it took me quite a while to come around to this conclusion because I really didn't want to believe it, you know.
Yeah.
But in the end, I was persuaded by the facts. She saw a cruise missile, and then she saw this thing disappear over the trees, and then just moments later, she heard this just huge explosion. And I believe that that's what caused the crater there at the alleged crash site. It was a cruise missile that caused a crater, and that's why there was no plane debris on the site, because the plane had been just liquidated, probably 5,000 feet up, something like that. And the seismic signal was the signal of that cruise missile impact. Now, why would they do that? Well, they had to create some evidence that so they could some basis for a cover story that this thing had crashed when in fact it had been blown up.
So why would they have blown up the plane, Mark?
Well, you might, you can speculate about it. I mean, if they wanted to destroy it, why didn't they simply order a fighter to go in there and shoot it down with a Sidewinder missile? And they could have done that. They could have rousted NORAD fighters, but we know from the radar data that there were no NORAD fighters anywhere near Shanksville. At least none of them showed up on radar. And the only plane that showed up on radar near Shanksville was this C-130, piloted by Steve O'Brien. He had been taken off from Andrews earlier that morning. He actually had a encounter at the Pentagon. He was instructed by air traffic controllers to tail this rogue aircraft that was incoming. Turned out it was the one that hit the Pentagon, and I do believe that plane did hit the Pentagon, Flight 77. After that, he was instructed to just continue on his flight path, and he was on his way to Minnesota, and he had another coincidental, and this I believe was probably a real coincidence. He was diverted out of the path of Flight 93 just as he was approaching Shanksville, Flight 93 as he was approaching Shanksville, and they did a zigzag around Shanksville, and that's when he reported seeing smoke, and that was at 10:05. Okay,
right.
And this is all we have. This on this part of the air traffic control record. We have the transcripts and the tapes, and there's no evidence of any alteration. I believe this is real data, and the time that this was time clocked, and the timer when he reported seeing smoke. And this was midair. He did not see a plume coming from the ground. He just saw smoke in the air in the vicinity of Shanksville, and the time was 10:05. Okay, so whatever happened to the plane had to have happened before that. And that tells us that Flight 93 did not cause the seismic signal at 10:06, right? So these had to be two separate events.
And the thing that really gets to me then is, I mean, if you need to stop a plane, if you reckon that the plane is heading towards a target and you want to prevent it from reaching that target, there are other ways. I mean, if your cover story is going to be that passengers brought down the plane or that they overpowered the hijackers or whatever, which I suppose is feasible. We don't know what happened there, but, well, I certainly don't know what happened there anyway, but to leave such a glaring gap, both literally and metaphorically, in Shanksville, whereby there is no wreckage, surely that's not the way to go about doing it. I mean, why such an extreme measure that, again, you would have to try and explain away? And they've been very successful in explaining it away, or in avoiding having to explain anything at all. Most people are completely diverted by the main event at Ground Zero, I suppose. But I'm
well,
just...
John, I never really answered your question. I was getting around to it. The question was, well, why would you have to obliterate it like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the answer, one possible answer, is that these planes, if they had simply crashed, if for example you shot one down with a Sidewinder, there might have been incriminating evidence on that plane that would have survived just a regular plane crash. so they had to be obliterated. And the plane that hit the Pentagon was obliterated. Plane, and I believe it was a plane. That's a huge controversy. I try to stay away from it. I don't. Let's not go in. Let's not go there this morning. And the ones that hit the World Trade Center, they were obliterated. There may have been evidence aboard those planes. For example, there may have been. I suspect that Flight 93 was packed with explosives. There may have been other evidence they could have survived just a regular crash that could have been incriminating.
So you are of the opinion that that plane was heading for a target of sorts?
Well, we can't be sure, but I think you could certainly argue that it was headed for the Capitol, maybe, Washington, and something went wrong. Maybe if something went wrong with the remote control, and they had to resort to a backup plan to destroy the evidence. That's possible. I don't know if you've ever flown into Washington, but the target, the Capitol, certainly is a tempting target because it is so huge. And I've flown into Washington many times, and on a clear day, you can see the Capitol building from 100 miles away.
Right.
So, you could even, it'd be an easy target.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting because you've mentioned easy targets and remote control. The Twin Towers, despite their size, most aviation experts seem to agree that they are not an easy target, bearing in mind the flight paths. So,
that's right.
Let's talk about that.
Especially at high speed. At high speed, it's very, very hard to hit a building like that.
Yeah, because we're told that these guys went to Floridian flight schools for a couple of lessons, and all of a sudden they're able to target these extremely difficult targets incredibly successfully, and down come the towers. Right. So what are we looking at there? Because that's not adding up for me at all, Mark.
Well, it does point to remote control. There was a flight instructor. I don't know if you heard this story. I wrote this up in my first book, The 9/11 Mystery Plane. At a Phoenix airport, there was a training facility there where they had simulators. And on the morning of 9/11, there was a flight instructor who had a class of pilots who were learning how to fly a 737. And they were in the simulator, he was teaching them, and then suddenly, the 9/11 happened, and everybody was glued to the tube, watching it, and they shut down the airport, and they were all stuck there at the airport. They couldn't get home. So he just said, well, let's go back into the simulator and see if we can hit the building. And so they set this simulator for the World Trade Center, and this was a 737, and they went in there, and these were trained professional pilots. Now, one of them could hit the World Trade Center, despite repeated efforts. And the instructor was able to do it finally after several attempts. And you have to remember the 737 is a lot smaller than a 767, much more maneuverable. And yet, at high speed, most of those pilots were not able to do it. So, draw your own conclusions. And they have papered this over and covered this up in the media. They just never told us the truth about this.
Yeah, and there's another interesting anomaly then that ties in with that, and it's the passenger manifest, because we hear so much about the hijackers and Al-Qaeda and who it was, and we were shown pictures of who allegedly flew these planes and who masterminded, etc., but there are some kind of glaring errors and omissions with regard to passenger manifests and stories changing. And you know quite a bit about this, so enlighten me a little bit, Mark, because I'm fascinated by it.
Well, actually, this is an area that I didn't go into in very much depth, just kind of touched on it. But yes, we know that a number, I think at least 5, maybe 7, of the 19 alleged hijackers were found to be alive and well after 9/11. Including one guy was a pilot in Saudi Arabia with the Saudi Airlines there. And apparently it was the same person, his photograph, he saw his photograph in the paper, thought he was, and couldn't believe it, and so obviously it was a case of stolen identity theft. And of course this should make you very skeptical of the official story. This was this was a job, something you would expect from an intelligence operation.
It almost seems beyond ridiculous to me, along with the fact that there was no kind of wreckage apart from a big pile of dust that was left by the trade centres when they came down. Apart from one or two very convenient hijackers' passports, which again, I mean, it's just beyond ridiculous.
This was true at every crash site. There were pieces of paper, a driving license, and then there was a letter that was discovered at another site. And these supposedly survived, and are pointed the finger at Al-Qaeda. So it was just too convenient.
Something else is the issue of the jumpers, quite a controversial one, but so many people jumped from the building rather than staying. Fires or heat or whatever it might have been, but what can you tell us about what actually might have gone on with regard to the technology? What brought down the towers? Because we've already discussed that, well, it wasn't the planes, or we don't think it was the planes. So what could it have been? And is there any kind of a connection then with the sheer numbers of people? And anecdotally, it appears that at times the sky was raining bodies from people who were preferring to leap to certain death rather than take their chances with whatever was inside. I mean, that wasn't just jet fuel.
Well, what I discovered was that after the 93 event, there was a bombing in 93, they changed the policy at the World Trade Center, and the doors to the roof were locked.
Okay.
Those people that were trapped on the upper floors were really suffocating from smoke and heat. It must have been really terrible up there under those conditions. The fires were not strong enough, were not powerful enough to bring the towers down, but they certainly caused a lot of smoke and heat that could have killed people. And those people were trapped. They couldn't get out to the roof. If they had been able to get up on the roof, they would have been. They could have been rescued by helicopters. But you have to wonder if this was an intentional thing, because it's possible that they would, if they had survived, they would have been eyewitnesses, and they might have had something to report that would have been incriminating. Like explosions going on.
Yeah, it's something that just always struck me. There were news helicopters, and I mean, there are videos that are freely available where you can see, well, it's assumed that they're news helicopters. There are one or two helicopters in the area, and the last thing they're doing is trying to help any of the people who are plainly stuck at the top of a building in extreme distress. And I mean, that just doesn't add up to me. It just flies in the face of any kind of humanity on a very base level.
It would have been difficult to try to save people from the windows, so at the upper floors. That would have been really tricky. I don't know if they could have. Maybe it could have been done. Barbara Honegger, another researcher, seems to think that they could have saved some people that way, but it would have been risky, and much safer to just set down on the roof and take people off that way. But the doors were locked; they couldn't get up to the roof.
Okay.
And so those people, you can imagine what it must have been like, just a horrible experience, their last moments. And some people probably became so panicky and so hot and suffocating that they just chose to jump. Brought them down. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, let's talk about that. What did actually bring these buildings down?
Well, the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth have put together a pretty good website where they systematically look at all the evidence, and all the features of a demolition are present. So there's like about a dozen different characteristics of a demolition, all of which were present on 9/11 at the World Trade Center. So I would encourage people to go up to the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth website. Just Google them and go up there. They have really excellent videos and where they interview their engineers and experts about all the evidence and just cover it. Very persuasive. It's a very persuasive case that they make. I think the numbers are now up to around several thousand engineers have signed on to this site. So there's a lot of expertise up there.
And these are people who are willing to stake their professional reputations.
That's right. And Richard Gage founded it. He's a very inspiring architect who goes around talking about this and trying to get on television networks and news shows and get the word out. as I mentioned before, I think I mentioned one of the failings of the official investigations, for example, the Nist investigation, is they never looked for residues of explosives, and if they'd looked, they would have found them undoubtedly. We had an independent team of scientists that reported finding, you probably know about this, they found residues of nanothermite in the dust.
Yeah.
And it's very likely that thermite was used to take out, I would guess, the upper stories. There's a lot of controversy. There's a pretty interesting debate going on right now within the 9/11 truth community about nanothermite versus the evidence for mini nukes that would have, some argue, and I think there's a pretty strong case, that would have been needed to take out those really huge columns at the base of the buildings, because I don't know if nanothermite could have done that.
Yeah, because let's face it, it's something that, again, I think is glossed over quite a lot. The pile of rubble that was left behind, it was incredibly,
it was very little,
it was incredibly
it was only
small.
6 stories. That's not what you would expect.
Yeah, I mean, for the amount of steel and the amount of cement that was contained, where did it go? It seemed to just vaporize almost.
That's right. A lot of the concrete was simply atomized, converted to dust, and that took an enormous amount of energy to do that. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to do that. Usually, if you have an earthquake and you have a pancake, in a third world country, you have these buildings that are not built to stand earthquakes. They come down, they pancake, and you see one layer just sitting on top of another. Mm. Well, that didn't happen at the World Trade Center. There was no pancaking at all, and it defies the laws of physics, really, because you had this plane impact way up high in the building where the steel columns are a lot thinner, and they're trying to make us believe that the weight of the upper stories crushed the floors below. That doesn't happen, because the strength is down below. That's where you have the really strong columns, the thick columns. And it was perfectly intact, So, that dog don't hunt. It just doesn't wash.
Yeah, so we've all this evidence that certainly flies in the face of the official story then. So do you think it's possibly some kind of black budget energy weapon that was used? Or, you mentioned mini nukes there. There are many different theories that are espoused by different people. So what's your own gut feeling or your instinct with regard to what was used and who exactly used it?
Well, you mentioned Judy Wood. I read her book, parts of it. I haven't read the whole thing. I've looked through it, and she brings out a lot of interesting facts that we should look at. I don't really believe. I don't think there's any that some exotic weapon was used. Mm. I believe there was a Russian intelligence dump recently, just a couple months ago, and this is reported up at Veterans Today. Your listeners can go up to that website and review this evidence that supports the mini nuke hypothesis. Apparently, the Russians released some of their own intelligence data indicating that, according to the Russians, the Sandia lab actually studied the World Trade Center dust, and this was a secret study, and they found the radioactive isotopes, indicating that mini nukes were used, and that these were fission fusion weapons. They were probably neutron bombs. And they believe that they actually identified the specific weapons that were nuclear artillery shells that the U.S. had passed to Israel back in during the H.W. Bush and Clinton years that had been reconfigured. It's pretty shocking stuff, and I'd like to see that Sandia study. It hasn't been released yet. So it's not proven, but it's very compelling, and I believe, and I've been trying to convince the Gordon Duff, who runs that site, to post that Sandia study. He apparently has it. He has part of it anyway. That was part of the dump. But they haven't posted it yet, so...
It also ties in with some of the anecdotal evidence that exists from first responders and the massive health problems that they have had since 9/11, a lot of which seem to be consistent with radiation poisoning.
That's right. You have the leukemias, and you have the specific types of cancer that are usually associated with radiation. That's pretty clear.
Yeah, and I think the figures are completely off the scale, again, beyond coincidence. So, Mark, it brings me on to what I think is the elephant in the room, and that's Building 7, the Salomon Brothers building, which of course was the third skyscraper that fell. And again, to me, it's staggering that so many people haven't heard of this yet, but a lot of people haven't, and that's fine. So let's tell them about Building 7, because for me personally, there are many smoking guns, but it's the main one. I mean, it was the one that certainly made me sit up and think, hang on a minute, this is just beyond ridiculous. So what was Building 7, and what's the significance of it?
Well, let's talk about that. First of all, I think this was a mistake. This building was supposed to come down during the collapse of one of the other towers, and it would have been hidden by all the dust, so no one would have seen it go down. And somebody screwed up, and this is one of the like possibly in the case of Flight 93. This plan, 9/11. They screwed up in a few cases, and Building 7 is the most obvious screw up. They brought this building down at 5:20 later in the day on 9/11, and right in broad daylight. And we've got numerous videos of this thing from different angles, and you can see the building just come down. It looks just like a controlled demolition, and undoubtedly that's what it was. And they kept this thing quiet. The footage has never been shown on mainstream U.S. TV since it happened. Wow! So for a very good reason, because if the people saw the footage, they would begin to suspect that this was the truth. They would begin to suspect the truth. So yeah, this was a 47-story building, steel frame. Would have been the tallest building in quite a few states in this country, and yet a lot of Americans, 40-50%, don't even know that this thing came down on 9/11. And Rudy Giuliani had his Office of Emergency Management there on the 23rd floor. It was the crisis center for New York City. And apparently they abandoned that crisis center that morning and set up a different crisis center down on the pier there. FEMA was there. There were all kinds of training exercises going on 9/11. One of them was a chemical attack, and FEMA was already there the night before 9/11, all ready to go.
Oh, there we go again, a classic sign of a false flag.
Absolutely. And the Securities and Exchange Commission, very curiously, had their files. They had, I think, 2 floors there, 2 or 3 floors. And those were the floors that burned. There were only a limited number of floors in Building 7 that actually burned. And it was the Securities and Exchange Commission offices that burned, and all their files were lost. Many investigations into corporate crime, all those records were lost. Very conveniently.
Yeah, very, very convenient. Another convenience there.
Yes. And, we know the Securities and Exchange Commission had been shredding files anyway. I mean, they've been doing that since the mid-'90s. And, destroying evidence because it's such a corrupt agency. But maybe that wasn't enough. They needed to, there were so much evidence that needed to be made to go away, and that was part of it. CIA had a huge office in Building 7, and the Department of Defense, and there were insurance companies there too. And there's a lot of reasons to bring the building down. We can only guess, but...
And one of the very interesting things about it, I don't know how commonly spread this information is in the US, but it's with regard to the BBC reporting of the collapse of Building 7, with it still standing in the background before it actually happened.
This was reported on the BBC that morning, and you can find this footage on the internet, and you can see the building in the background. It hasn't fallen yet.
And I mean, if there's nothing else, if there's no other shred of information or evidence that doesn't scream conspiracy or cover up or lies, surely It's that
Absolutely.
the BBC.
This is the one that you just can't ignore. It's so obvious.
Well, yeah, it's complete proof that the BBC, at the very least, knew that building was going to fall before it did. And
this collapse was never mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report. Not one word about it. And Nist completely ignored it in their report about the World Trade Center collapse in 2000. I think it was a 2005 report. Mm. They don't mention it. Then they put it off, and it took them, a number of years to try to put together a convincing explanation for it. And they finally came out with their report on Building 7 in 2008, just as my first book was going to press, and we were able to do a short write-up on it. But the hypothesis that they advanced, the explanation, is just cockamamie. It's just ridiculous. And they never never made their computer model available for other scientists to look at. So it's basically a black box, their computer model, and the thing was clearly it was they reverse engineered this thing. Mm. They reverse engineered their computer model to generate the desired outcome. That's what they did.
When you add all of it's not even one or two pieces of isolated coincidence. I mean, it's one thing after another. We've been speaking for the last hour and a quarter, roughly, and it's been one thing after another.
And we're just scraping the surface here, Well,
that's exactly it. I mean, we literally could speak for days and weeks and months about this, and the evidence would continue to mount. But one thing I would like to talk about before we start to wrap things up for this episode, Mark, is the consequences and what 9/11 meant, not just for the US, but for the world at large, because it has been the fulcrum around which global geopolitics and the world and our everyday living has changed, because things have changed beyond all recognition and in an unprecedented way in terms of the speed at which they have changed. So let's talk about what it actually meant, what happened in the immediate aftermath, the Patriot Act obviously being something. So how did life change in America, and what were the knock-on effects then worldwide of 9/11?
Well, if you just look at, you can, like you say, there's so many things we can talk about. But just for one, look at the economy. You had the boom years of the Clinton administration, when there's plenty of work in the country, and after 9/11, everything changed. Now, the jobs have gone offshore, and I remember when I was a young man, I never had trouble finding work in the 70s and 80s. If you didn't like one job, go out and get another one. And that's the way it was. It's been that way. It was that way for many decades. I've talked with guys who lived through World War II, and they told me it was the same way then. There was always work. Go down to the mill, get a job. You don't like that one, go out, get another one. Or get an education and work your way up. The American dream.
Yeah.
But that's gone away now, and that we have kids who are going through college. They come out of college, they're deep in debt because tuition's gone up so much. And there's no job waiting for them. And you have these engineers working as bartenders or taxi drivers, or they, and they just give up. And people are demoralized because of this. So these students, they're not thinking about activism or politics. They're just thinking about trying to survive, their own life economically, finding a job. We never had that when I was younger. It's changed so much, and I wouldn't want to be graduating from college these days. It's just not a very bright outlook out there for most of them.
Yeah.
That's just one thing that's changed. And you mentioned the Patriot Act. Well, this was ready to go. They didn't write this in the aftermath of 9/11. They had this thing already written. In fact, I believe it was ready to go probably in 95 at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing. The Mura building in Oklahoma City. That was another false flag. I think the evidence is pretty clear there too.
Yeah.
But the event wasn't dramatic enough. It wasn't big enough that they could get it. That they could succeed in moving us forward into this war on terrorism that they wanted as a pretext for all this foreign intervention. And these. To basically make the world safe for Wall Street so we can loot anywhere we want to. That's really what the goal is, I think. That's the end game. They want a free hand to go into any country they want, forget national sovereignty, just turn loose the CIA, these covert operations, and if that's not enough, we go in with the military to take control of the oil resources and anything else we want and blame it on terrorism.
And that's exactly what has happened. If you look at any of the regimes that have been toppled in the aftermath, it's always interesting to look at the economic situation and what currencies they're using and whether they're US petrodollar backed or whether they're involved with Rothschild-based central banks or not. And you look at, for example, Iraq and Libya, and it's just...
That's right.
It's amazing. What you have just described is exactly what is happening. It's almost like that the Wall Street puppeteers can use the military machinery of the United States now, post 9/11, to step in and totally obliterate any kind of a system that exists that's not to their liking or that they can't milk and rape.
Well, we saw this in the case of Iraq with Saddam Hussein. He sealed his own death warrant when he began to accept euros for oil instead of just dollars, and that was the reason we went in there, undoubtedly. And same thing happened to Muammar Gaddafi. He gave up his nuclear program, and we thought that everything was he was now in the good graces of the powers that be, except that he began to take gold and other currencies for oil, not just dollars, and that was it for him. And Iran has been trying to get started an oil bourse. They call it a bourse. I guess it's a kind of a trading exchange where people can go in and buy their oil and use other currencies, and that is the reason that Iran has been in the crosshairs, but they haven't been able to attack Iran yet. There's undoubtedly that's in the plan, but part of the plan, but they haven't been able to make it happen yet. Probably because Russia and China have been defending Iran and continue to do business with Iran, and so it's they had to put this off. They delayed it, and in the meantime, of course, we're seeing the attacks on Syria and this disastrous Middle East nightmare. It's just spreading now. It's one big war in Iraq and Syria with the rise of these ISIS, funded by the Saudis. Undoubtedly that's where the funding came from, and the support, and the U.S. also supporting it. But I think the Saudis finally have waked up, that realize that they have unleashed a Frankenstein monster, and it's going to turn on them. And I think there may have been a change but it's probably too late.
Yeah, and all the while, Wall Street gets richer and bigger, and machinery of war continues to generate massive, massive figures. And that's what it appears to be all about. It's money and power as opposed to anything else. There's no humanity in what I would perceive as a psychopathic control system. I mean, remove even the individuals or the cogs in the machine from it, and what you are left with is a system where anybody is replaceable on an individual level. And it's very interesting. I don't know how that necessarily can be stopped, and certainly one way it can't be stopped is by seeking answers to the problems or solutions from those who are precipitating and exacerbating those very problems. They're not going to change anything for us. So let's talk about that, John. That's a really important point. It looks to me like what is taking place is the politics of relative advantage. Because the U.S. I believe that one of the motivations for the U.S. and we haven't gotten into it yet. We haven't had time, but I think the U.S. was responsible for the overthrow in Ukraine that happened last February. These neo-Nazis were involved, and we supported them. And I believe one of the motivating factors here is simply to make things really bad over there, to hurt the euro, to hurt the European economy, to make the dollar look better than it really is. Just so it's kind of a relative advantage. We try to stir up turmoil and cause mayhem somewhere else, just to make our divert people. Part of it's that, to just divert attention away from the problems here at home. But
we are in a real serious bind right here with our economy and with our dollar. And I think one of the strategies is simply to try to play this, make this the house of cards stand for as long as they can. You know, they're resorting to all sorts of stopgap things to keep it going.
Yeah, and I think the sticking plaster that they're applying to the wound is working in the short term. I know certainly in terms of, for example, Ireland, where I'm based, the impression that most Irish people have of the US is still the American dream. It's Hollywood, it's Disneyland, it's Obama, it's the glitz and the glamour, and nobody thinks to scratch below the surface. I mean, even for a lot of people, 9/11 appears to have been a tragic blip as opposed to something that wakes them up to the kind of nefarious workings of what's actually going on, and as opposed to preempting the truth, really, because what we're trying to get at is the truth. And I think when people are willing to open themselves up to the truth as it exists, only then can things change. But the sticking plaster method that you've described there certainly seems to be working in Europe. And I do think that Ukraine and Russia is something that can wake some people up on this side of things, because Europeans see it as being a little bit closer to home, and particularly Central and Eastern Europeans, they get the politics of the region in a way that a lot of Westerners don't. And because there's such cross-pollination culturally now within Europe with the establishment of the EU, and I think that maybe it's one of the side effects that wasn't necessarily planned for when the EU was brought into existence. A lot of the knowledge has kind of cross-pollinated also, and I think Europeans are far more clued in to Eastern European politics and, by extension, Russian politics than they would have been in the past. And I think as a result, Russia, rather than being the great communist bear over there in the East, is now viewed very, very differently.
If the Europeans would simply look after their own interests and become dubious of some of the U.S. Foreign policies, just look after your own interests, then, for example, Germany. The Germans need, all of Europe, but especially the Germans, need the energy resources from Russia. Russia needs German technology. So you have, they're really natural trading partners.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm very suspicious. The NSA, we know the NSA was surveilling Merkel, German Chancellor Merkel's phone for many years.
Yeah.
So you have to wonder, did the U.S. find some way to control her, or are they simply paying her off with bags of money, like Paul Craig Roberts has been saying? Because she's not acting in the interests of Germany. And I think this is, I noticed that 3 of the former chancellors have been sharply critical of her policies, the way she has, just going along with Obama.
Sometimes it's just so obvious that she has become a lapdog, and that Europe has become, by extension, a lapdog for US foreign policy, that it almost beggars belief at times. It's just, again, we've spoken about a lot of ridiculous anomalies with regard to 9/11. The same ridiculousness exists with regard to European attitudes to the US, in my opinion. Would you agree?
Well, you have you're much more in touch with the European frame of mind than me, John. I've never been to Europe, and I try to follow it, but I can't. I don't have a handle on it like you do. Yeah, you live there, so.
Yeah, that would certainly be my opinion. And in Ireland, I mean, there is nowhere except perhaps the UK that is more Americanized than Ireland. It's almost like another state, and that is a traditional cliche, but I think for so many different reasons. It's nothing to do now with cultural and historical reasons. When you look at rendition flights that are being used by the US, the stop-off point is supposedly neutral Ireland. We have 2 airports existing in the west of Ireland, which is very sparsely populated, that can facilitate all kinds of NATO and US fighter planes and bombers. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. They're basically US Air Force bases without the permanent stations. They're stop-off points and refueling points for the US military.
I would strongly encourage your listeners to become active on some of these things,
But I couldn't agree more. And here's an interesting one for you. Only today it came to light. There are a number of politicians, and I'm not a huge fan of the political system that exists here, but there are a number of politicians who would be seen as crackpot politicians in Ireland, and they've been quite recently elected. 2 of them attempted yesterday to inspect in Shannon Airport in the west of Ireland, to inspect US military planes that were being guarded by the Irish Army and were arrested per se. And I just found it very, very interesting to see the media backlash, and by extension the Irish public backlash against the two politicians who had attempted to highlight Ireland's supposed neutrality and the contradictions that exist there with regard to the relationship with the US, and how they have been ridiculed ever since for doing exactly that, which is, to my mind, standing up for the interests of a sovereign nation, or what should be a sovereign nation. So I agree with you fully. People need to become aware and become informed of these issues and actually do something about it instead of pontificating from an armchair. I think people actually need to take back some of their power and take personal responsibility for what's going on around them. Only then can something change, in my opinion.
Well, you really hit the nail on the head, John. I agree totally with what you just said. People need to take back their power.
Well, I must say, Mark, I would love to speak for another hour and a half. It's been absolutely fascinating, and we will speak for another hour and a half in the future. There's so much we can speak about. But before we go, can you give us a little bit of a reminder of where people can find you online, and tell us about the books as well and how people can get their hands on your work?
Yes. All they have to do is Google my name and Mark H. Gaffney, and the name of my recent book, Black 9/11, and that should put them in in touch with a lot of material on the internet. And they can go to my website, which features my Gnostic book. It's gnosticsecrets.com.
And that's something I'd very much like to speak with you about in the future as well. Mark, we'll get those links up on the website for you as well, so people can just click on alchemyradio.net. But in the meantime, I have the power, you have the power, we have the power. Mark Gaffney, it's been fantastic speaking to you today and enlightening on Alchemy Radio. Thank you for joining me.
Been a lot of fun, John. Thank you. Keep doing what you're doing.
Alchemy Radio.